Maybe one stay? Can I leave it all behind? Follow all the leading signs. When the dark is growing and the light is closing in, tell me where you're going. Won't be a simple voyage.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm telling you, it is just crazy. Everything's going haywire over here, and there's no reason at all that we should have dropped off on the video feed. So I think I'm done. I'm done paying for a service that is constantly cutting out our connection. So we are back on YouTube, direct connected. And for those of you listening on the audio only, you're fine anyway. You're always fine. So it's going to be YouTube only from now on. I'll just put links on the other social media. We'll be back here in just a moment to continue our topic, do segment 2. And I'll give you the next comment from the ether. Don't go away. Oh my God, I'm telling you, this is just crazy what's going on here tonight. I mean, I've never seen the whole, I mean, it's like we got gremlins or something.
I think we do.
Oh my.
Time for another house blessing.
I mean, it's time for another drink.
Right. Well, we can arrange that.
Oh, okay. So we're back, and we've never left, again, the podcast version on Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify is fine. It's just the YouTube and video versions that are giving us issues. So I think we've pretty much isolated that the primary problem here is the simulcasting service. So we're just going to dump it. Okay. So going forward, for those of you who watch this, and I know there's a lot of people that just insist on watching on Facebook, even though I've told them week after week that the quality's not as good, and there's other issues involved with that one. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Okay. And not only that, you can watch it on your smart TV. So you can see us in the big screen. It's a lot more comfortable sitting on your couch in your living room watching the TV instead of having to watch like your phone or something. So we'll put a link on Facebook and everything else, Twitter when we go live. But yeah, watch if you want to watch the live video version of this show. From this point forward, it is going to be YouTube only. I'm tired of paying money for something that is trash. And this is trash because I'm dealing with this every single episode. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe it was the settings on the encoder. And I changed the settings, and last week's show was flawless, but we didn't simulcast. We did a direct feed to YouTube, and it was, I mean, I think it had maybe a couple moments of buffering, but nothing.
Yeah, it wasn't anything significant.
Nothing significant. Nothing that knocked us off.
It didn't interrupt the whole.
That's the problem. It's like, if you're going to buffer, that's fine. Okay, that happens with streaming. Okay, I get that. But cutting off the signal, this is ridiculous. It's coming from the simulcaster, so we're dumping them. I'm tired of giving them money for something that doesn't work. Sorry for you guys who like to watch on those other platforms, but you're just going to have to come over and become a subscriber on YouTube. Okay. But anyway, we're back here, and it looks like most of our audience is back from. I hope you found us. This is another reason to subscribe.
Hard part's gonna be, where do we pick up at?
I know, right? Yes. Well, I know where I'm at, but I mean, those of you who have not subscribed to YouTube, make sure that you do, because you'll never know when a new feed comes up. You know, if there's a break or something like that, like what happened just now, I put a part 2 up there on YouTube, but unless you're subscribed, you're not going to get that notification. Make sure you also not only have subscribed, not only have you liked the video, because that helps us too, but that you've also put notifications on. That way you'll know everything. Anytime we go live on this channel, you'll know it. Okay. And right now we got a real solid stream. It's running at exactly the levels that it needs to, and it's not going through the simulcaster. Isn't that something? So clearly
no prostate problems.
No prostate. Yeah, it's a solid stream.
Right.
Yeah, yes. Yes. Yes, we're quite healthy in that department. All right. So let's get to tonight's second comment from the ether here. Well, the first one was a question. This one's going to be a comment. So a lot of you, I'm sure, who follow the social media, whether it be Instagram, Nicolay Network, or Facebook. I don't post on Twitter. Jamie Wolfe does the Twitter now because they haven't kicked her off yet. But
they want to.
Well, I mean, didn't you tell them that you still work with me? That's all.
I didn't
I
didn't say shit.
Well, that's all they're gonna. That's all. If you want,
I'm not on there nearly as much as I used to be.
Well, good for you. That's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
But you probably saw that I put out a picture of Jamie Wolfe and myself, guns at the ready. In fact, you can see Jamie Wolfe's gun behind her back, because we had these poachers coming on the property and trespassing, criminal trespass actually, which they were charged with, and we're thankful for that. We're thankful that the game warden was very helpful in this respect, understood our problem, and took care of it. They were actually charged with multiple different violations. I won't get into them all, but just so you all know, the situation is, it was rectified to the furthest extent that the legal system allows. Now, if he continues to violate things, then we can take it further. But the game warden didn't seem to think that he would. But anyway, that night he came to my door, open carrying a semi-automatic pistol, and was kind of belligerent with me and demanding his property back that I confiscated, because he had a hunter's stand on one of my trees. And so it's like, well, I mean, I asked for their name, they wouldn't give it. I asked to see their ID, they wouldn't provide it. I asked for their phone number, they wouldn't give it. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to take your damn property, and you're going to want this back. And that's going to force me to figure out who you are. And it worked. I took the property, I put it in my garage, and sure enough, he showed up.
In fact, he'd listed it on your property. So you were just clearing up the litter he'd left on your property.
Yeah, that's how I look at it. In fact, I should have been able to throw it in the fire. I didn't want to keep it. I only took it so that I could assure that he'd come back for it, which in that case I could get the cops here to identify him so that we could prosecute. That was the whole point of it. And it worked perfectly. We were able to. But before that happened, couldn't get in touch with I couldn't get the cops because the signal on my phone was so bad, and he had showed up, but it just so happened it was Mass night. Jamie Wolfe was pulling up. And so when I went back up there to deal with it, he was still there, and Jamie had already arrived, and she was ready for him. She was standing behind her car, ready for whatever could go down.
I had good cover.
Yeah, good cover. But he started tapping on his gun a little bit, trying to intimidate us. So at that point, we had.
That's when I tapped on mine.
Yeah, well, that's when you pulled yours, and I pulled mine, and we were ready for a shootout, Old West style, if it came to that. Unfortunately, he just drove off really slowly. But
I don't know if it was both of us being armed and me not taking any of his shit, or you coming out in your full clerics.
Yes, I was actually ready for Mass, so I was dressed in. I mean, out of all of the hours of the week, okay, I only wear
machine gun preacher.
I only wear that cassock, 2 hours a week, which is basically the preparation for Mass. If it's a normal week where you only have one Mass on the week, that's the only 2 hours that I'm in it. So he just happened to come at that right at that time, right before Mass started, which is why we were late. And sure enough, he was pretty much startled by what he saw, and I'm sure he didn't expect a Hellcat to come out from underneath that cassock. I don't know. He left, and he called the cops on me. Which was all I wanted, because then that means that he got identified, and he did. So his name's in the police report. We know where he lives. We have his address. It's and we were able to get the game warden over there to prosecute him, which has occurred. So hopefully the game warden didn't think that we'd have any more issues with him, but I did put some more cell cameras out there in the woods. So these are cell-based cameras. They tell me exactly when there's something going on. It sends a signal to my phone. So even if they destroy the camera, I'll still see them approaching the camera. So it's a good thing to have. And with a property this size, you kind of need it with people like that around. So anyway, I put that out there. And of course, I was my typical non-bishop self, where I thought I'd have a little fun. There's a little bit of I guess you could say that the part of me that is 1% celebrity, 99% everything else. But it's like, I do recognize that we do have fans, and we do have people that enjoy the little adventures we go on. There are people that are, Bishop Bryan and Jamie Wolfe fans from Ghost Adventures that focus on what we do. So I try to cater to them a little bit with fun posts. Okay. So I speak their language, folks. I don't try to put on this pretentious little show. I speak the language of the people, because I'm talking to the people. And so I put the little picture of you got Jamie Wolfe out there, gun ready to go. You got me ready to shoot his ass, dressed in full clerics. And the caption is, Jamie Wolfe and I don't just fight demons, we fight dipshits too. Here we are, guns at the ready, while this asshole poacher attempts to intimidate us with his bullshit. I call this photo, fuck around and find out. Well, okay. So, there's everyone who's followed me on Twitter for years has come to expect that this is the way that I am. I'm a no-nonsense kind of person. I don't pretend to be something else. I'm not Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, for God's sake. And then, there's this one person that said, is Bishop Bryan using that language? And then I responded, I said, Bishop Bryan speaks the relevant language of the society in which he works. To do otherwise is to pretend one is above one society. This is why I'm effective in the real world, and the rest of the Catholic episcopacy lives in la-la land, which most of them do. I hate to break it to you, but they do. But anyway, that's not the comment for tonight. Tonight's comment was from Gary on the Exorcist Bishop page on Facebook, and he wrote, I pray you can find forgiveness in your heart. And for heart, he uses the heart emoji. And so, this didn't sit well with me because it sounded like the typical Christian pretentious bullshit. And I called him out on it. So I said, forgiveness for what exactly? An armed man repeatedly criminally trespasses on my property and threatens my family's safety and peace of mind. Such a person doesn't require forgiveness. Such a person requires a definitive response that makes clear to him that there are severe consequences for doing so. And he responded back by saying, God be with you, with the praying hands, which I think is actually not praying hands. I think it's like the high five, but
we turned it into a
praying hands.
We turned it into a
but I think it's high five originally.
It's originally supposed to be high five, but we took it over.
We took it over. Okay, so he put the little praying hands. So Blaine, I love this. I love this. Blaine, we love you. You know, Blaine comes back and says this to me. They say, as a retired law enforcement officer, I couldn't agree with you more, Your Holiness. Don't feel bad about the title because that's actually the correct title for a patriarch. I don't use it because it's, again, too pretentious for me. So, you know, but there are a few people that do understand the protocol and actually use it. I think it's respectful. It's very nice, but I don't ever require it. And I would never expect anyone to ever say.
I would think it'd make you feel awkward.
It's a little weird. Yeah. I mean, it's like we're too small of a church for titles like that anyway. But, you know, anyway, he used it. It was nice. And he says, you can't keep turning the other cheek until they finally end up causing injury to you on your own. Protect yourself, and if necessary, fight the good fight to protect those you love and kick their asses into eternity if necessary.
So Blaine is my
Blaine.
people.
Yes, Blaine is our
being
people.
Being a retired cop, we could probably, tell all kinds of war stories together. So Blaine, you're awesome.
Blaine is awesome, but I wanted to bring this up because I think the turning the other cheek thing is, again, another part of Christian theology that people do not understand.
Totally misunderstood.
It is used as an excuse for Christians to bow down and submit to abuse and every other thing under the sun, because they think that in their understanding or their limited understanding of what Jesus is saying, that means that we always just give in. The reality is that God doesn't forgive anyone who doesn't come to him for forgiveness first. This person doesn't want my forgiveness. This person trespassing on my property, threatening my family's safety, could give a good shit about forgiveness. He wanted to intimidate me. And when someone tries to do that, guess what happens? I intimidate them worse. And the difference between them and me is that I actually follow through on my threats. They're just cowards pretending. I am not. So when it comes to situations like this, turning the other cheek doesn't apply. Okay, that's not the context in which Jesus was referring. He did not expect us to just simply, sacrifice our kids over to criminals just because, they did us wrong and let's turn the other cheek. And if they want to hurt us, well, let's let them hurt us. No, that's not what it means.
They're confusing virtue with passivity. They're not the same things.
And weakness and kindness for weakness. Passive. Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. And see, this
is a much broader problem in society. We're such a genteel society now that anything that's confronting or difficult or involves use of force, people automatically think must be wrong, and that's not true. It's simply not true. You committed no sin whatsoever in that interaction.
In fact, I think it would have actually been.
I wanted to commit a few sins, but I held myself in check.
Father, I think it would have been more of a sin for me to back down and put my family further at risk. Because I have an obligation to take care of them.
That wasn't going to happen. Yeah. I mean, at the very least, this guy knew when he de-asked the property that, number one, we're not those pushover Christians, and number two, fuck around.
I think it sent a very clear message to him that this is not a place to screw around, so go find somewhere else to do it.
He already had one warning as well.
He did. He did. That's the other thing.
But in terms of turn the other cheek, one of the best analogies I've heard of turning, because it's not about being passive, it's quite the reverse. It was Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I don't know if you know this story, but he told the story of turn the other cheek like this. He said, he was walking down the street in apartheid South Africa, and an Afrikaner was walking towards him, who basically there was only room for one of them on the pavement, and one had to step into the gutter. And the Afrikaner said, I don't move for gorillas.
Yes.
And Archbishop Desmond Tutu stepped into the gutter and said, I do.
Yeah.
That's turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right.
It's to turn it. It's not exactly to fight. It's not fighting fire with fire. It's to turn it around to something far more profound and godlike.
Correct.
And to say, I'll step into the gutter because you're a gorilla. You know?
And see, that's what they don't get about the Christian message. And this is the same kind of errors that we saw with the first comment about, sinning and, thinking that you can do anything you want. And because Jesus has already done the work for you, you're okay. But that's not what Jesus taught. That's, so there's so much in Christian, and this is the danger. And this is what I was trying to say last week, and maybe even the week before, and maybe even on Brandon's show, that there is real danger to bad theology because people are being misled into thinking that they can do things that are contrary to the scriptures. And because their pastor, who might not even have an understanding of it themselves, has taught them that it's okay. And this is the kind of thing where, not value. Like, let me give you an example, okay? Putting no importance at all into the sacrament of reconciliation is disastrous spiritually. It's disastrous. Because the one thing, the most powerful tool you have for assuring your salvation has just been thrown in the toilet by the majority of Christianity. And that's
not yet the majority, thank God.
Well, I don't know, Father. I mean,
it's a majority in America, but not a majority worldwide.
Well, my problem is that statistically you're correct because, Catholicism and Orthodoxy is still a larger number. But how many of those people are even practicing anymore?
Sure.
That's the danger. I mean, that's the problem. Is at least the Protestants are devout. I mean, they do go to church typically. A lot of Catholics claim to be Catholic, but they don't. They go to a government organization. They ask them what their denomination is. They'll say Catholic. But then when you ask them, well, when's the last time you went to church? It was like 50 years ago.
Well, they're Catholics, but they're actually atheists.
Exactly.
A lot of them are. By Catholic, what they mean is they were baptized in the Catholic Church because their parents were Catholics or their grandparents were Catholics.
Right.
But, and again, it's that kind of, that makes a work out of baptism, right? Oh, well, I was baptized in the Catholic Church, don't need to do anything. But,
that's true.
No. Baptism is about fulfilling promises that your parents made for you or your sponsors made for you when you were baptized. But if you don't, own those promises yourself, then what's that about?
I mean, think about what could happen if you took the fervor of Protestantism and integrated it with the correct theology of Catholicism. You have like a perfect church again. That's the thing that I'm seeing, unfortunately, is that, these non-Catholic churches are very successful. They're doing very well, both financially as well as in terms of bringing people through the doors and keeping them there and encouraging more people to show up. So they're growing. They're not shrinking. The Catholic churches are not doing that, not in America, not anywhere, as far as I know.
Not in the English-speaking world, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in South America it's still normal.
But if you look at what's leading to that growth, and I kind of touched on this last week, American, white America was founded by Puritans, okay?
Yes.
So, they landed at Plymouth in New England, and they spread eventually into the continent. Yeah, and yes, it interacted with Spanish Catholicism, on the borders, but it's Puritanism, and Puritanism is sort of it always has this sort of appeal. It's so funny. People actually love to be told what to do. It makes us tear our hair out because, as libertarians, you think, oh my God, the government, the government lie to you all the time. They're despicable people, but you want to give them more power. Right. You want to keep listening to them. And so, and I'm not an anarchist, but, you've got to, at some point, analyze what's going on in the world. Now, Puritanism still has that appeal, and it does it both within, Christianity, broadly speaking, in the church sorts of churches you're speaking about, and of course it does it in wokeism, which is secular Puritanism, because that's all about poking the finger and saying, basically you're a mortal sinner because you left your heater on, when it wasn't that cold,
or you ate a steak.
Right. Oh well, yeah, I'll be guilty of that every day.
And actually, both are similarly unforgiving. Yeah. Because again, the root of that Puritanism is a Calvinistic belief that you're part of the elect because you've been gathered into this, sect.
Right.
And so, then, so the sort of need for forgiveness, if you said to a Puritan, an average Puritan, a Zwinglian, why don't you go to the sacrament of reconciliation? At best, they'd just laugh and say that's completely unnecessary. Jesus has died for my sins already. At worst, they'd say, you're all heathen, calling people father is against the scriptures, blah, blah, blah. So there's actually very little common ground to speak of, even though we have the Bible and the creeds. But because they read the Bible and the creeds so differently to every other Christian and most Christians that have ever lived.
Well, they've made an idol of it, Father. I mean, it's an idol that they worship now. They don't worship the true God. It's they've created an image of God and they've created a God in their image is what they've done.
Yes.
And that's the biggest, I think, the worst sin. I mean, it's
actually the original sin.
It is the original sin, isn't it? Yeah, it is. I mean, honestly, that is the first commandment. It tells you what not to do, and that's the first thing you're not supposed to do. And they don't see it. They don't. I mean, you could talk into your blue in the face and try to get them to understand what they've done here, and they don't want to see it. There's a certain level of extreme humility that comes with following the magisterium. We're an independent Catholic Church. We're not obligated in any way to follow anything that the Church of Rome does. Yet, we don't challenge it at all on more than 99% of what it teaches. In fact, more than 99% of what it teaches is our catechism too. There's very slight variations, just a few things that we do differently. Not necessarily even see differently, but we just approach them differently. And I've talked about some of those differences on the show before, like abortion, for example. We don't feel that automatic excommunication is the right response to a person who commits the act of abortion. We feel that a person that is contemplating murder because their society is telling them that it's okay needs Jesus the most. In fact, I would say that that's a person that needs the Eucharist and the grace that the Eucharist can provide more than anybody else. And yet to deprive that person of the very thing that can connect them and correct them is, I think, a very serious matter. So, I mean, Church of Rome teaches excommunication. We don't. So that's a variation. That's a difference. And we have a different approach to it. The Church of Rome continues this medieval approach that, people still care that they care about being disconnected from the church. I don't think they do anymore. I think if a person gets excommunicated from the church, the typical response today is, well, the hell with them then. Whereas in the Middle Ages, it would have been like, oh my God, what have I done? So yeah, excommunication had some impact 1,000 years ago, because people would look at it and be like, you be not just excommunicated from the church, you're excommunicated from society. When everyone was Christian, everyone was part of the church. It was part of the world in every capacity. Today, it's a small part of people's world. Even people that claim to be devout Catholics, it's only that thing they do for an hour on Sunday most of the time. So excommunication doesn't carry the same weight. It's not the right approach for today's world.
But I think it's actually connected to your first question too, because one of the real problems of Western Christianity in general, including within the Western Catholic Church, is the idea that sin and grace are transactional.
Yes.
So in other words, if I can build up sort of 80% of this sort of sin in my life, and I'll be all right. But 2% of this sin, and and I think, and look, I'm not saying it's not helpful to talk about venial sin and mortal sin.
But you have to understand what that means. It's not like it's a minor sin and a major sin. That's not the right way to look at it.
And I think because it can go wrong so easily, it might actually be the time to get rid of it as a principle. I mean, the Orthodox Church doesn't talk about
sin is sin, and it's like if you do in the Orthodoxy, a white lie. Sin is just as serious of a matter as murder and rape. And you might say, well, that doesn't make sense.
But likewise, equally forgivable.
Equally forgivable. And that's what makes
really challenging to non-Christians.
That is very challenging. And also understanding that, well, what's the classification for then? The classification is for what are the ramifications for what it does to you spiritually, not the consequences in terms of what you deserve as the result of it, or what the ultimate consequence is, but what does that do to you spiritually in your process? That's the only difference. So a venial sin means that a venial sin doesn't directly sever your connection to God, whereas a mortal sin does. And that needs to be healed in order for more grace to flow, which means that if you fall into mortal sin, then it's easier to completely lose your salvation, but not necessarily because the matter is more severe, but because of how it impacts the person's relationship to God. That's what the venial and mortal designations are. But ultimately, all sin is punishable by death if you look at it from basic theology, from the most minor to the most severe.
Well, and also, I mean, deceive ourselves if we think it's feasible that we'll die with no sin at all.
Yeah,
I think that is a total.
Only if we're lucky enough to get the last rites and then just go.
Yeah, that's true. But even then, I don't know. I think it's. I think we fall into a sort of Gnostic idea of, this notion that we can sort of that we're ridding ourselves of anything at all, as opposed to it being the grace of God.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I mean, there's the great. I think my Fulton said, if I get to heaven, I'll have three surprises. The people, I'll be surprised by some of the people who are there.
Yeah.
I'll be surprised by some of the people who are not
who
there.
aren't there. Right.
And I'll be really surprised that I'm there.
I'm there, yeah. I have heard that.
And Fulton Sheet. I mean,
that does sound like him.
And again, I think it's because, look, transactional is the least good. It's not bad. It's just the least good way. It's like saying, I want to go to confession to hell. It's not bad, but it's the least good motivation. The best motivation is to say, I want to be perfect, in that humble, kenotic, self-emptying way. I want to be perfect. So the way that we encounter grace is not to treat it transactionally, as if to say, like that, the premise of that first question, doesn't matter what I do, Jesus is good and therefore I'm all right. That is a really sinful way of looking at the sacrifice of the cross, what the enormity of that, that God becomes a man and submits himself to death.
Well, it really pisses me off when I see people tell me that I'd rather be wrong and believe in God than, and then how do they put it? It's like, I'd rather believe in God and be wrong than not believe in him and be wrong, in the sense that it's like they see their belief in God as like almost like a fail safe, something they can keep in their back pocket just in case. Yeah. But that's not going to have any more impact than just simple. In fact, I'd say it's safer to just come out and be authentic and say I'm an atheist and say I don't believe, and because that at least opens up room for the gift of faith to maybe come at some point in the future. But if you're just using belief and faith as some kind of little fail-safe just in case so that you don't end up in hell, I mean, that's a surefire way to go to hell.
Selfish. It's totally selfish and undermines the gospel and the need for the church at all.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
you think, okay, so the gospel reading on Sunday in our tradition was about the wedding feast. That they send out the invites and nobody responds. So he says, well, then the master of the feast says, well, then go out into the highways and hedges and invite anyone you can find. And that's the job of the church. That the church through the ages has reached out and gone into the ditch to find you and say, actually, the wedding feast is for you.
Right.
Jesus is inviting you to become a guest at this feast.
Right.
But don't turn up without your wedding garment on. So now for people who say, well, I'll believe, transactionally, I'll accept this truth just in case there is a God, therefore I can be saved. I don't think you will be, because the whole point is you are then supposed to become the signpost to other people. So that's what tradition, the handing on means.
Yes.
That we have received, and then we go out and give to others.
Well, it's pharisaical, isn't it? It's the ultimate hypocrisy. I mean, it's not genuine. There's no authenticity. That's why I say it's safer to just say, I'm an atheist. I'm struggling with faith. That at least leaves room for maybe God to reach you with it. Because I do believe, and I teach this. I do feel faith is a gift. Right. I don't feel that is something we can attain to ourselves. I think it is given. I think that is kind of the nature of when the Bible talks about the elect. I think what the elect are those that were given the gift of faith. Not everyone is given that gift, but it is available to those who seek it. I do feel that those who seek it will receive it. That's the caveat. So it's not just because, okay, this person got it and this person didn't, that the person who didn't is shit out of luck. It just means that the person who didn't now has to seek it. And maybe that's, again, part of the mystery of God and trying to figure out exactly what that person needs for their salvation. But I feel that it has something to do perhaps with their particular process versus another person that has a different challenge that they might have to face. It
also reintroduces the faith works interaction. That they actually feed back on one another.
Yes.
So, Jordan Peterson, when repeatedly asked, "Do you believe in God? Do you believe in God?" I live my life as though
if I do.
God exists. Now, actually, that's in a way, that's somebody that doesn't have that immediate gift of faith,
right?
Applying the right principle, and actually, in doing so, that generates faith,
right?
Because if you live your life as though something's true, you are actually putting your faith in it,
right?
No matter, and therefore, that's where that interaction overcomes gift, the gift or not. Because, you'd have to ask yourself the question, well, if it's a gift, then why does God not give everybody the gift of faith? Well,
ask for it.
Ask for it.
God allows for the obtaining of that faith through, and he does it through other people. And that's why we have to take our life, our role in the life of the church seriously. Yes. We go, no, it's not something that I achieve for myself that I might go to heaven. What, you want to be alone in heaven? That would be hell.
Yeah. It would. I mean, it would. But I think, there's again, it's part of these misconceptions that get perpetuated into the Christian religion that have taken a life of their own. And largely what people think Christianity is today is not anything that it started out as, and certainly not what the fathers of the church would have taught.
Well, I think it's a list of behaviors.
It is like behavioral. It's a type of psychology now. You're right. It is. That's exactly a very good way to put it, Father, because that's exactly what they've allowed it to become, and it's not that. It's so much more. It's a way of life.
And listen, it does offend people's reason when you say, actually, a murderer who's been led a risible life can, in fact, come to faith in Christ in jail, and before they die, confess that they'll go to heaven. And likewise, somebody who is adamant that there is no God and preaches against any faith in the church, but leads a virtuous life, can go to hell.
Yeah.
Now, I actually believe that to be true.
Yeah.
Of course, I don't believe God wills anybody to go to hell, but we can, by our own stubbornness, our own refusal to be humble or to empty ourselves, end up there.
Because the virtue is not in the actions themselves. The virtue only has value when it's combined with the faith that supports it. That's the thing that is right about at least the spirit of sola fide. I get the spirit of it because it is important to understand that faith is the foundation to it all, that there are no works that can ever be good enough. That is true. But if you have the faith, then the works actually speak for themselves. It speaks for that faith. It lives that faith. It supports that faith. It encourages that faith, and everything that those works do become the faith, and that's where it matters. That's the difference, and that's what's missing.
And this is expressed in ideas of salvation. A Calvinist, a Protestant would say, "Are you saved?" Now listen, their concern for other people's salvation is a good thing. That actually, that's where they are motivated to share the gospel, to get people into the faith. That is not something I would want to take away from those people, right? I think that's a good thing, and we should all have that concern,
right?
But actually, if somebody asks me, "Are you saved?" Well,
I would never be so presumptuous to answer the question.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like I hope so. We're working on it.
It's a very arrogant question. I mean, really. I mean, how can anyone answer that?
Well, there is an answer, I think, that is not mine, but the late Metropolitan Callistus Ware gave when he was asked this on a train. He was wearing a cassock, and he thought, well, if I say no, I'm not saved, then my interlocutor will say, well, then why'd you drive around the country wearing a cassock? And if I say I am saved, then I'll actually be being presumptuous and not being kenotic and humble. And so he said, I think that the answer from an Orthodox perspective, theosis being their major focus, is to say I am being saved. And I'm really satisfied with that.
I like that.
In the process.
I am being saved, and so I'm being saved, but there are things I can do to stop that. Christ has thrown the life belt into the water, and I'm working my way to the life belt, but I could give up.
That's well said. Well said. Okay, well, we're halfway through the show and just those two comments and questions. So I knew they would be big ones, but they are important ones, and I think they're questions that come up in different iterations over the years. I know that even though we've addressed it now, it won't be the last time I'm asked those questions. They'll come up again. So let's now get to your questions. We have half the show, almost a little more than half the show, actually. We're not even quite at 9:30 Eastern time, which means that we are now ready to start taking your questions from both the chat room and from callers. We'd love for you to call in, and that number to call into the show is 347-514-7150. That's 347-514-7150. When you're prompted, enter PIN number 376-8923. That's 376-8923. That will put you into the queue, and then I can bring you on the air. We'll answer calls in the order that they are received. If you are an international caller and don't want to incur the long-distance charges, you can call us on Skype completely free of charge by dialing Eye of the Seer, EYEOFTHESEER, and I'll bring you on through Skype. So give us a call. We'd love to hear from you, but if you'd rather just talk in the chat room, which a lot of people prefer to do, we can do that also. So, Jamie Wolfe, what's our first question for tonight?
All right. I was able to save a couple from the prior broadcast. One of them, the person dropped off. We have one from Creepy Spice.
Okay.
And kind of going in a different direction.
I think they're still here. I think I've seen some Creepy Spice.
Creepy Spice is still here. Yeah, the other question, I believe someone said that they left. They're on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Do you have any advice for someone who is living with someone who may be one of the few people being outwardly tormented by their own thought forms?
That's a good question.
It is a good question.
By living with someone, you're talking about like a roommate kind of thing, or are you talking about an intimate relationship?
Doesn't specify. Creepy Spice, can you specify?
Okay, so first of all, I want to say this. For those that were listening, I mean, I don't know if Facebook might not be connected now, but I mean, this is why it's so important for Facebook to be a subscriber here, because this is where we're going to be from now on. So if one of the moderators wouldn't mind going to take this YouTube link for part 2 and going on Facebook right now and linking it to the Facebook group, so that Facebook on the Exorcist Bishop, I know that some of the moderators have the ability to post there. If you wouldn't mind going there and putting that post up for us, that would be fantastic. That way, at least the ones that were listening on Facebook can reconnect with us here on YouTube, and hopefully they'll get the message that they need to start watching on this. But to get back to the question.
Okay, so it's her boyfriend of 8 years.
Okay, so they're living in a relationship of fornication is what I'm getting out of this.
Well, yeah.
Okay, so that matters. Okay, that matters, because even though society tends to see extramarital relationships, intimate relationships as no big deal, it is a big deal, because there is an exchange of energy there. Okay, let's take the morality out of it for a minute, because I know a lot of people can't connect with that part of it. You know, they've been too secularized to really understand the moral implications of sex outside of marriage.
Well, the metaphysics of it makes sense.
And that's why
you just can't go around,
Yeah, because if you just say, this is against the laws of God, and it's not going to get through to people that are in the contemporary world. It just won't. It won't. It actually pushes them further away, I find. So I don't even go there. Let's just talk about metaphysically what's going on. Okay. Sexuality is truly the ultimate exchange of energy. Okay. It is a frequency exchange. And when you engage in a frequency exchange, like sexual intercourse, what you are doing is literally giving part of your energy away to this person in a way that there is no taking it back. It truly, whether you intended for it or not, makes you one flesh, just as Jesus said. All right. It wasn't just some moral thing that he was teaching. He was teaching you some metaphysics. Unfortunately, the church has moved away in the modern era from metaphysics. Even the Catholic Church has moved away from it. Protestantism never dealt with it. And so therefore these kinds of issues are not even addressed. They just make them moral problems. It's so much more than morality. Morality isn't really the big deal. Morality is just the system to kind of keep you away from making these major metaphysical errors and then ending up into these major metaphysical problems, which is what fornication leads to. And that is what happens, is that when you give your energy away, there's no getting that energy back. So every time you have sex with someone, you lose a part of yourself to that person. Okay. Marriage binds you together. So therefore, instead of it being just an energy drain, like a vampire, I'm going to use language that I think our audience will understand. This is like a recycling. A marriage is like recycling the energy. So the energy goes out, it comes back in, it goes out, comes back in, because the sacrament binds that person together. And when you're monogamous in that relationship, the energy is consistent. There's no break in that pattern. So you reinforce each other. Instead of draining each other, you're actually building each other up. And that is done through the action, hopefully, of love. But even the sexual energy itself is still being reinforced in that context. When you have an extramarital affair, even if it's with a monogamous person for a while, you're still not recycling the energy. It's draining the energy, which is why, incidentally, a lot of long-term, or I should say, a lot of extramarital relationships don't go long-term. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do, but not often. Not often. And understand also that the sacrament of matrimony is something that, at least in the West, the Eastern Church would disagree with this. This is one of the conflicts between East and West. But in the West, it's conferred by the couple. The priest is the witness. The priest acts as the witness of the church. But it's actually the man and woman confer the sacrament on each other, which in theory means that it could theoretically be done without the need of a priest involved. Just like baptism doesn't necessarily need a priest. It's just desirable that a priest would be there. So I sometimes wonder if some of these long-term relationships where they have like common law marriage, it just sort of works.
I think they are marriages.
I think they are. I think because they conferred something mystically. Yeah.
The idea that, these days we think that marriage is formally in a church with a priest and blah, blah, blah. But actually, there's no great antiquity to that. I mean, a young man and woman making vows to one another behind the hay wain, then going to the priest and saying, we've made vows. The priest writes it in the register. They're married. Right. So there's two elements to, like, if you, again, going very Catholic and legalistic about
very Catholic.
If somebody applies for an annulment, there's two elements to that. There's two questions to the annulment. One is whether it was valid or invalid. The second is the form. Yeah. Now, so people say, well, I was never married in the Catholic Church, but it's okay. And they go, no. How did you get married? What were the circumstances? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I was single. She was single. We made vows to each other. Right. But it was before a civil celebrant. The church says you're married.
Yeah. Yeah.
So unless there's other grounds for annulment, that's not one.
Right.
So so I think they are. Look, and listen, I'm not preaching from I'm not on my pedestal here. because I understand the human frailty and have made grave mistakes myself.
You're on your throne, Father. You're on your throne.
I am on the throne. Yeah, it's got arms and everything.
It does.
But
you look very regal over there. It's like watching the nobility of days gone by. It's wonderful.
Well, we are mercifully still a kingdom, despite the best efforts of the Labour government.
I mean, if I freeze frame you right now and put a little crown on your head, you look like you could be nobility. Honestly,
it comes naturally to English people.
I think
I'll come and be your king if you like.
There you go. We could use a good king because our presidents suck out here.
I'd be the best king going because I'd tell your president, no, you're not going to do anything anymore. You just let people be. Get out of the way. I'd be the best king because I'd take no action at all. But anyway, I think so I'm not underestimating or showing a lack of compassion for people who are in different situations, shall we say. I do think that they can be resolved, and this is where I think especially the Orthodox do have a better way actually of economia,
Well, when it comes to multiple, when it comes to the annulment process, I mean, I wouldn't even say Orthodoxy really has one in the same way. No. It's more of
it doesn't need one.
Doesn't really need one. It understands that
theology of marriage.
Well, they do because they understand that divorce is a product of the fallen world, and that sometimes people make mistakes, and that there's opportunities to rectify those mistakes, and they allow those opportunities to happen. Whereas in the Western church,
more importantly, that just because somebody's been, had a marriage breakdown or a relationship breakdown, that it only it levels up bad on bad if that person then can't take their life in their place in the life of the church.
Right.
So it's to say, and also, I think it's again, people end up getting punished within the church because they've been honest.
Yes.
Because they did get married and then it's fallen apart.
Yes.
And then, you're divorced and remarried. Whereas the person who's had, 30 sexual relationships as a young person but never got married, then they get married. Oh, everything's fine with them.
Well, I went to this might be a foreign concept in Europe, but in the United States, it happens. It's kind of almost a foreign concept here too, but it's prevalent. I mean, it happens here. But I went to a non-denominational private Christian college, Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida is a non-denominational Christian college and university, and they attract students from high schools that are far more rigid in their private high schools that are far more rigid in their Christian teaching. Some that even have schools where boys and girls are not even allowed to walk on the same corridor. They have like a boys' corridor and a girls' corridor so that there's no funny business between classes, stuff like that, which is completely unhealthy and not even realistic, in my opinion. It's making a mockery, I think, of morality, in my opinion. But anyway, that's another story. And we can get into it if people want to. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there are people that are coming from this world and then entering into the adult life of university, and not knowing how to deal with this now because they were never given the tools to prepare. Okay, so they never ever had an experience where they could be alone with a member of the other sex. So what we were seeing a lot in my freshman year of college, I see these girls completely timid, even afraid to talk to you, and then 2 months later they'd be married. And be like, what the hell's going on here? And it turns out what was going on is that their sex drives were in overdrive now that they were free and interacting with people of the opposite sex, and never had the control or the ability to temper it because they never were able to practice that temperance and learning how to manage the maturity of growing into understanding how to interact with the opposite sex appropriately, to the point that they only saw, I got all these hormonal emotions and I got to get them out. I want to have sex. Well, we're going to get married because you can't have sex outside of marriage. So let's just get married. I wonder how many of them are still married today. Probably not too many of them. I don't know. But that just goes to show another example here. So I want to answer.
People do get married younger for that reason.
They do, and that's
Right.
not. I don't think that's necessarily a healthy choice to make. It's about maturity in every respect, and also understanding what you're doing. But I think the real restriction on sexuality has nothing to do with morality. I mean, ultimately, you're not detracting from God in any way. What you're doing, though, is you are misusing the faculties of creation that have been entrusted to you by being made in His image. That's the problem with having loose sex or sex that's not part of the marital component. So when you get into a situation like this, I always have to ask that question, because that actually has a lot to do with what's going on. If there's an energy drain, then that's going to compromise the person and limit their ability to correct what's going on paranormally that's completely unrelated to their fornication, but the fornication is making them metaphysically weak to deal with it, because they are not able to recycle that energy appropriately with the correct exchange with a partner that they are completely spiritually united to. Okay, so the question was, they're getting thought forms. They're producing.
I'll read the whole thing again.
Okay, read it again, because we went off.
Do you have any advice for someone who is living with someone who may be one of the few people being outwardly tormented by their thought forms? Outwardly tormented by their thought forms.
I mean, well, the advice always comes back to the same thing. So it's the same thing that I do when I go in cases. Okay. The first question I ask is, what is your spirituality like? What are you doing? Do you go to church? Do you have a pastor? Do you take it seriously? How many hours a day do you pray? That's my favorite question, because when they hear the word hours, they're like, everyone's like, I'm supposed to pray hours a day? Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
In fact, you're supposed to pray without ceasing, but I mean, I'm going to forgive that one, because you probably don't know how to do that yet. Because to do that correctly and not disrupt the rest of your natural flow of your life is a tricky process, but not unattainable. That's what monks have learned to do. That's what they master.
Spiritual discipline.
It is. It's a spiritual discipline.
And again, if people want to learn about that, they could look up on YouTube Callistos Ware, the Jesus Prayer.
Yes.
And he, because I mean, I was very fortunate to be lectured directly by him
yes.
on this.
Yes.
And you know, he's amusing and of course deeply insightful. And in Oxford, this works, you know, that even waiting at the bus stop, you know,
yes.
Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me.
Yes.
And how you interact that with your breath.
Yes.
And that's how you get to the praying without ceasing.
Correct.
That actually, every breath, to borrow from Sting, every breath you take, you know, you're praying.
Yes.
And so, you know, and it's a good thing. It doesn't make you holier than somebody else.
No, it's about relationship.
Yeah.
It's about just being connected to God as we are supposed to be. It's just getting us back to where there's an everlasting flow of grace and exchange of that relationship happening at all times.
I think Creepy Spice might be getting at the question of, you know, if you, and she says living with, so we've got no idea what this relationship is, but or he.
Well, they said boyfriend.
No,
right?
it's her boyfriend of 8 years.
Okay,
yeah.
but it's what to do if you live with somebody who is having these.
So they've been together for a while.
These issues, you know.
Well, and that's true. It's just the reason I wanted to know about the intimacy factor is because that's going to have an impact. If it's a roommate, it's a very different approach than if it's a significant other, but there's actually no sacrament present. Because again, the leakage of energy, I cannot emphasize enough how much energy sexuality. Look. Let me give you a little lesson from the Eastern world. Now, I'm not talking the Eastern Church. Now, I'm talking like Hinduism. Here, I'm talking about yoga. Okay, one of the processes in yoga, very closely related, of course, you know, to Kama Sutra. And there's a right-hand path of Kama Sutra, there's a left-hand path of Kama Sutra. And there's different ways to integrate it, just like a lot of things in the East, that there's ones that are more spiritual and symbolic and ones that are actual and physical. And the left-handed paths here will the mystic will attempt to attain to spiritual levels of enlightenment using the energy of their sexuality by channeling it in certain ways. And one of the ways that this is done is to have several women It's usually a male that does this, although I can't see why it couldn't be a female, but it's not the traditional thing because, I mean, patriarchal societies and all that. But typically it's a male, and he will be pleasured by 2 or 3 females for the course of several days. And he is brought to the point of climax, but is not, he must, within his will, not allow himself to orgasm. That creates a physical tension that can be channeled into a type of spiritual development that leads to an awakening, a type of moksha. Okay. Kind of like the Hindu version of enlightenment. Now, Christians, this is so far outside the paradigm that, I mean, they don't even want, they feel like they're sinning just by hearing these words. But the reality is there is a spiritual thing that's going on here. And I'm not saying that, going and attempt this version of spiritual enlightenment. There's better ways to do it, I think. But the fact is, it does demonstrate the power of the sexual system. And by not allowing the orgasm to occur, but being pleasured builds up the energy, but he retains the energy each time. He then, instead of channeling it towards pleasure and release, which is what most people would want to do in that circumstance, think of how suffocating and frustrating it would be to be constantly over the course of days, be brought to that point and not allowed to release it. But the mystic takes that energy and channels it inward, not giving it away, not bleeding it out. Even when you read in scripture about the verses that are used to kind of justify the church's position against masturbation, spilling the seed and all that, is actually a reference back to this metaphysical thing I'm talking about.
There's also why footballers are advised by their coaches not to.
Well, any contact sport.
Yeah.
So like in law enforcement, we prefer intact dogs because they make better biters.
They're a little more aggressive. Yeah, they got the energy for it. And see, there's truth to this. So the reason I asked the question and why I'm putting so much emphasis on that aspect of it is because that really does determine what you do from here. So if there is that much energy being bled out, then the person's far more compromised, and you have to take much more serious action than somebody that's existing within an energy exchange with a committed partner that is sacramentally bound to them, which protects them. All the sacraments are protective in nature. Even matrimony, it's protective in nature. It's not safe to be in a relationship without matrimony. It really isn't. It actually isn't.
Well, and essentially, I mean, all of this is why. There's no such thing as casual sex. I mean,
right.
That's it.
No, people like to think there is
culturally normative. Yeah,
right.
Well, but it's not.
Movies make it seem like you're not in touch with reality unless you're having casual sex. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, they're inundated with it.
No matter how consensual and culturally normal it is to have multiple partners, no one cares. It's not like the people that they've been in these relationships with are going, "Oh, I wish they stuck around." Like everyone's kind of consenting in this. But it's really destructive and dangerous. And it's not, and like you say, it's not about moralism. It's not about pious reasons, although they're not bad reasons. But
I think it gives a frame of reference. I think the reason that it again, the church tries to keep it simple. The Bible tries to keep it simple. So rather than go into these complex metaphysical explanations that would be over most people's heads, it's just easier to say, well, this is God, what God wants you to do. And just leave it at that.
And that's also true.
Yeah, and that is true. It's not wrong. So it's not like you're not. All of it. It's just not the whole reason. It's not just like this one thing. It's multiple things, and there's actual reasons for why God wants you to do things this way. It's not because he's trying to be controlling or something else. And certainly I'm the first one to say the church has no business in people's bedrooms. But there are reasons why the church teaches on these things because there's actual metaphysical justification for it. But for the answer to the question, again, it's going to get back to getting the person spiritually healthy. Okay, so if a person's bleeding out archetypes, if the person's bleeding out thought forms, they're not spiritually healthy. That's a spiritual illness in the worst possible way. That's like spiritual cancer. That's like a spiritual heart attack. It is not normal. It is not healthy. It is not functional for a human being to project out thought forms that torment them. That is because the person is dealing with some kind of internal trauma that instead of internalizing it into some kind of repression, they're externalizing it into some kind of thought form that ends up torturing them in much the same way that the trauma might have done, which we see a lot with victims of child abuse. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't for those that don't repress it and it turns into some kind of like a neurotic disorder later on in life, what ends up happening is it gets projected out into a thought form. And so now they've got this spiritual abuser that continues to molest them in the form of an incubus or a succubus.
Right.
And this is what we tend to see a lot of. So what you're having to get down to the root of is the fact that the person that's having this happen is spiritually sick and you need to get them well. There's only one solution to that, honestly, and that is a relationship with God. I don't know of any other cure for that other than a committed relationship with God. And if a person says that they go to church and they're doing again, then I get back to, well, how many hours a day do you pray? I guarantee you they're not doing an hour. They need to be doing several hours. How often do they go to church? I guarantee you that they're probably not as committed to that as they would like you to think they are, if they are at all. A lot of people like to call themselves Christian, but they haven't been in a church in 5 years. Well, I'm sorry, you're not a Christian at that point. You might believe in the Christian faith, but that doesn't make you a Christian. Believing in the Christian faith does not make you a Christian. It's what you do.
It's like me saying I'm a golfer, but I don't own any golf clubs, and I don't go to a golf
That's
course.
exactly what it is. It's like you can believe in the game, right? You like the game. You enjoy the game, but you can't call yourself a golfer unless you actually play the game. So it is that's a very good analogy. So
this actually ties in with another comment from the ether.
Okay.
Which I'm sure Tiffany. I know I think she's watching.
Okay.
Tiffany won't mind me naming her. I don't think, but this came in through the church app, where she asked about the Charlie thing, egregores, is the name Charlie connected with anything? And,
yes.
And the comment in that context was about, thought forms can come about because of this indulgence. But I was reflecting on the fact that the converse is true. That if you spend hours in prayer a day, or at least the holy hour, again, Bishop Fulton Sheen said, this is not good advice. This is a commandment of Christ. He said to the disciples in the garden, can you not keep watch 1 hour with me?
Yes.
That actually, that also creates a thought form, that focus on God,
yes,
that invocation of the Holy Spirit, that, if you go into these ancient churches in England, I mean, you were spoilt rotten in England. We've got churches that are 1,500 years old, more. And you go into these places and they pray for you.
Yes, they do.
You go and you can just feel it.
They do.
It's coming out of the walls.
I mean, I think it's important that people understand, and this can sometimes, I have to say this carefully, because people will sometimes interpret this and say, I can't believe you just said that about Jesus. Because they think I'm trivializing him or minimizing him in some way, and I'm not. I'm actually trying to show how clever he is as God. It proves even more that we're dealing with God here. We're dealing with someone with God abilities, because we're just not this clever. But Jesus Christ as the hero of the gospel is an archetype. He took on an archetype intentionally. It's part of what he did when he became man. Because becoming man was more than just taking on flesh. Becoming man was also taking on a particular archetype for the purposes of the message. This is why I say to people that don't believe that there's any historicity to Jesus, and they try to tell me that, he didn't really exist or something. It was a fiction. Someone wrote it up. It's like, it doesn't matter to me. Why does it matter to you if he was historically accurate or not? At this point, the power of the archetype is already very much present. It's shaped for 2,000 years an entire civilization, more than all around the world. I mean, it's its own society now. It lives. Whether Jesus existed or not is actually irrelevant to the fact that he lives now in the form of this archetype that has continued to perpetuate into people's lives, changes people's lives, heals people's lives. It's still there. So,
and for the Sola Scriptura crowd, by the way, this is completely biblical, because what does the Gospel of John say? that he is the Logos.
Yes, the Word.
That's the archetype. He's the archetype of the Logos.
Yeah.
You know, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yes.
You know, that is the archetype that is absolutely foreground by St. John.
That's exactly right. You know, the way that we understand these things is limited, and what the way they're taught is even more limited. So what it ends up happening is that people get taught something that's very limiting, and then they understand it with even less comprehension than it was taught, which limits it even further. We need to reverse that process. I hope that the Nicolaitan Church has done that, because that's really the point of esoteric Christianity. It's not some deep, dark, occult kind of church. That's not the point of it. I know there are some churches out there that call themselves esoteric churches that kind of go in those different directions, or use the word esotericism because it's kind of an occult term and it's kind of cool and it's really with the program, and, you know, they're trying to be provocative, and, you know, that's not the context in which this church uses it. This church is trying to get back to the root of the way that these things can live within us, you know, instead of just limiting them to words that you read or verses that you memorize, but things that actually live inside you as entities do. This is a kind of like a positive kind of possession, because, you know, we talk a lot about demonic possession, but we don't talk a lot about how any archetype can possess us. And there are beneficial ones, and there's ones that you want to actually take into your being and let them sort of take over for a bit when you're struggling, because they can actually do things much better than you can in terms of connecting you to God. And the best archetype that you can take into yourself is Jesus. And this is what means, and this is one of the few verses that I do memorize, I've committed for my high school. Philippians, I think it's Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you that is also in Christ Jesus. I mean, how more biblical can you get to what I'm saying than that verse itself? It tells it all. That's exactly what you're doing. What is it to take on the mind of Jesus, other than to actually take that, integrate that archetype into yourself, so that you yourself become Christ-like as he was, you know, that you can fully emulate him in every possible way by taking him into you, the archetype of Jesus, not just the God, not just the man, but the entirety of the archetype that has been part of our existence.
That's why St. John the Baptist begins in other Gospels, not in John, but begins by saying, "Repent and believe the good news." That I've said it before. The word is metanoia. Mm-hmm. It's to change your mind.
Yes.
It's not that's what you're to change your mind into.
Yes.
The mind of Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers the question, but ultimately what it comes down to is that the person is disconnected from God, and they got to get themselves reconnected. The best way to do that is through the church.
She did say that you were hitting the nail on the head a little bit ago. So hopefully
that's what you do.
Maybe give you a direction to go in.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. It's not like I can say, here's an incantation, say this 3 times, you know, light this black candle, and it's all going to go away. That's just not going to be the way this works. It has to put effort in. There has to be genuine, sincere effort and a resolve to move in a new direction, to understand, to ask God to help them. If they're having struggles with it, then you ask God to help. And let me tell you, be careful with that prayer.
One of my guilty pleasures is whenever anybody says new directions, because
well, I mean, but the reality is,
I knew I'd get you.
No, you did. The reality is, you have to understand that God is a process, okay? And he is here to help you with that process. And all you need to do is ask. But be careful what you ask for, because you will get it. And sometimes it's more than you can handle. I think it was St. Augustine, I'm pretty sure it was, who said that God never gives you more than you can handle. I beg to differ with St. Augustine. I would challenge him on that one and say, oh, he absolutely does.
Right.
Because he'll get you out of it, but you're going to be scarred forever. I mean, you will go through challenges that will traumatize you. It's part of the process. And those things will be more than you can handle, and things that you never resolve, things you never get over. It's comes with the territory. That's the danger part of faith. People don't talk about the dangers of it. They just make it, oh, we get to live in paradise. We get to live forever with God. It's great. I can go out into nature and touch the deer, and they love me. People have these weird radical ideas about heaven that are just so far removed from reality. It's not even funny. Heaven's nothing like that. But anyway, what's our next question? We can probably take one more before the break.
It may have been answered already. I think Cheryl had a question. She was asking about what about non-sacramental marriages? Is energy recycled in those?
Well, I mean, again, this gets back to why I subscribe more so to the Western Church's interpretation of the sacrament, because I do believe it is conferred on the man and woman by each other. I do not think it's conferred by the church. I don't think the priest does anything. He witnesses it. He certifies it in the eyes of God. But it is really the man and woman that confer the sacrament on each other. And much like baptism, baptism doesn't need a priest. It's preferred that a priest is present, but it's not required for the sacrament to be valid as long as the form and matter are there. So, and intent. We have to have intent as well.
And consent. And
consent, yes, of course. So when it comes to matrimony, I would say that there is no such thing as a non-sacramental marriage as long as proper form, proper matter, proper intent, proper consent were all part of the equation. That makes it my sister-in-law was recently married a little over a year ago, and she didn't get married in the Catholic Church. She wasn't married by a priest or a person with apostolic succession connected to them. It wasn't sacramental in that sense. It was a little more than a justice of the peace, because I think it was a minister, but it wasn't the church is pretty liberal in terms of what it considers to be a valid marriage. However, it's like, for example, Tracy and I were married by a Buddhist nun in a Buddhist temple. We had to get remarried when we came back to the church because that was not considered sacramental. And of course, we were going into the Eastern Church where the priest actually does the conferring. So the theology was different there as well. So that was part of the thing. But, ultimately, though, you might say, well, we've been married twice. Which one was the valid one? Which one's the sacramental one? I would say it was the first one. I mean, that was the one from 20 years ago. I don't feel that what I felt I got on the day that we were sacramentally married was a blessing. I felt that I now had the church's blessing.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. But I don't think it was an invalid marriage.
I don't think so.
So I would say that I think as long as two people, and I'm going to say this very carefully because it's just like you could take your baby and go into the bathtub and dunk them 3 times in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and baptize them. I wouldn't recommend you do that. I recommend you go and get an appointment with your pastor and, go through the church for this. But you could do that and it would still be valid.
I only recommend that to grandmas whose children refuse to do it. Yeah. Children baptized. Yeah. I go, just do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree. When because you're not causing any harm. You're not forcing them to become Christian. You're giving them the grace to decide for themselves that when they reach that point of consent, then they can use that grace or they can reject that grace, but at least they have it. Whereas if you don't do it, now they got to start from scratch, and it can be a lot harder at that point. So it's always a good thing to have either way. But it's not recommended to do it that way. It's the same thing with matrimony. I think it's theoretically, it's not optimal. So, but I think theoretically, you could have a man and a woman fall in love
on a desert island no other alternative, and they decide that they want to live together for the rest of their lives.
Like Blue Lagoon. What was
Brooke Shields
and the other guy,
the other dude.
I don't remember.
No one cared
his name.
about the dude.
Anyway,
I don't remember, but I remember that movie.
I mean, that was a little
true.
Incestuous too. They were cousins, weren't they?
I can't remember. That was like what? That was like 1980.
It might have even been the 70s.
Welcome to England.
I don't remember. But that is, was that if they, committed to each other, obviously they had sex because they had a kid at the end. Was that valid? Yeah, I would say that's valid, even though there's no priest involved and the church didn't know about it. We're going to take a break here at the top of the hour, and we'll come back for one more segment with your questions after this.
That I'm a lonely soul, would you love me? take all my energy. Do you believe me that I'm a lonely soul? Would you love me? I've been searching, always wanted more. Can you hear me? Do you believe me?
Pushing my limits and all the drive that I have. Well, I'm going the distance with you. I didn't know what I had till I knew what was missing and everything that I dread. Well, I built a resistance with you. Catch me when I fall, and I'll keep you off the ground. You were gone, I wish you'd stay. I could look at you for days. Time was well spent, that's when I knew that I need to spend my life here with you. Take your time, not in the fast lane. I understand that you've been broken too many times, but I'll be waiting to make you lose from all you've taken. But if we listen to each other, admit our mistakes, then I can show you who I am, because I'm not the same. I'm better with you.
Welcome back, everyone, to the third and final part of Vestiges After Dark tonight. We are taking your questions, and the number to call is 347-514-7150. That's 347-514-7150. Enter PIN number 3768923 to be entered into the queue so we can take you on the air. You can also call international free. eyeoftheseer at Skype, eyeoftheseer. Just dial up on Skype and we can bring you on the air. But again, most people like to just ask questions in the chat. So if you got more questions, now's the time. And Jamie Wolfe and Father Chris Yates are looking at the chat and taking your questions and bringing them to the forum. When we come back here, we will also be looking at another question from the Nicolean Network that I wanted to address. And it looks, again, like the issue was the simulcaster, because here we did another segment without any problems, because now we're direct streaming on YouTube. We're not going through the simulcasting service. So there's something wrong with that service. I'm going to let them know when I cancel, because I'm sick of paying for something that doesn't work. We'll be back. Don't go away. So once again, make sure that you have logged your question into the chat room if you're not going to call, because, this is what makes the show fun, is having your interaction. Believe me, it'd be a lot easier to do this show, particularly with all of these internet issues. It'd be a lot easier to just pre-record and just put up a podcast once a week like most people do. Most people don't live stream their podcasts like we do.
We could make ourselves look really smart if we did that.
Oh, of course I could edit. I could take out all the crazy shit.
We
could put some strange supernatural things in there. We could do all sorts.
We could make it really clever. But, we do the live show because we like the interaction. I think all of you do too. But, when you're doing a live show like this, you need interaction.
We need live people with a live show to ask live questions.
That's the problem. It's like we need to figure out a way to get the show out there to larger live audience, because the live audience is so small compared to the on-demand. But the on-demand doesn't need it live. The on-demand just needs a pre-record. So I'm not taking it away. Don't worry. I'm going to still do it live. But I prefer it live. I think I'm on my best when I'm not pre-recorded.
Better.
I do too. Yeah. Okay, so the next question here came in from the Nicolean Network. Actually, it came in today. And something that I thought would be an interesting one. Another question that's frequently asked in various ways. And so I thought, why not ask it? So this came in from April on the Nicolean Network. And she says, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on seances? I know they are heavily frowned upon, just like the use of an Ouija board in the paranormal community. So I don't know if my answer was sufficient in her mind, but I mean, in my mind, I think it was perfectly sufficient, perfectly answered. I just basically said I find them unnecessary and rather pointless. I'm not going to pass a judgment on them and say, oh no, stay away, they're evil, it's going to conjure the devil. No, I don't really think that. I'm just going to say that you should be praying for the dead to move on. You shouldn't be looking for ways to attach them here. And seances tend to attach things here. That's the danger of it. But you're really actually not causing as much danger to yourself as you're causing to them. It's an irresponsible thing to do spiritually, personally. Now, there is a caveat to that, as there is to everything. I mean, nothing is definitively one thing or another. And there are circumstances where things are stuck and you're having a hard time communicating or connecting with those stuck things, that sometimes certain practices that might fall into the category of a seance, they might be considered useful in that capacity. Kind of like bringing a medium in, although I wouldn't say what a medium does is conduct seances, although some of them do. I also know a lot of mediums that frown on seances, but what a medium does is to try to make connections, hopefully in the interest
channeling.
of moving things on. But the Christian's responsibility is to pray for the dead, not to create conditions for them to get stuck, which means, and this is going to be the hard part for people to understand, okay? You want to talk about morality. Here's where morality gets confusing to people because they're very black and white thinkers. People are so black and white. They're so categorical. They have a hard time thinking outside the box, but if you want to be a good at theology, you have to think outside the box. There's no other way to do it. And so here's the thing. If there is any sin to commit to conducting a seance, it's the same sin that would be committed to you grieving beyond what is considered psychologically normal or healthy, because both of those conditions create the circumstances that can keep the loved one stuck. And that is, in my mind, a sinful action, because our responsibility, our duty to the rest of the church is to help the church move towards salvation, to move closer to God. Once a person dies, the best way to do that is to help them through grace, pray for them so that they can expedite, as far as things can be expeditious in this, expedite their process towards God. So I would say it's the same sin. Same thing like another thing that blows people's mind is like, what is the sin of homosexuality? Okay, you hear people, Leviticus, and gay people feel ostracized from the church. They are sometimes in many ways targeted by the church, or not the church, but some churches target them in very aggressive, hostile ways. And so the church is seen as a bigoted organization when it comes to homosexuality because of its position in Leviticus and everything else. But people don't understand what the sin of homosexuality is. And you know what it is? It's fornication. It's the same sin that all of you have no doubt committed, because most people have sex outside of marriage at some point in their life.
No, stop it.
They do. Whether they like to accept it or not, whether they want to admit it or not, it's true. The majority of people will do that, which means that you good Christians out there.
So all you judgy Christians out there.
All you judgy Christians that had sex before you were married. Yeah, casting your stone, are committing the exact same sin that the church condemns homosexuality for. It's because of fornication. Because the rules of matrimony, the way, not the rules, but the metaphysics of matrimony as such, is that it is to create the conditions for the production of offspring. Gay couple can't do that. And so therefore there cannot be the full conferring of a sacrament like matrimony, which is why it's completely erroneous for the government to confiscate the term and say that what they give at the justice of the peace is marriage. It's not marriage. Marriage is a religious term. The government has no right to it at all. So you can't have gay marriage. You can have a legal union, for the purposes of taxes and everything else, but the government cannot grant matrimony. It's not possible.
This is absolutely one of my hobby horses, because I agree with you entirely. What's happened is we've confused marriage with legally registered relationships.
Focus on the registered.
What my gay, especially gay Christian friends, and I'm thinking particularly of men.
Yeah.
They say it's so ludicrous, this whole thing.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we had a plebiscite on homosexual marriage, state marriage in Australia a few years ago, and of course the mantra was "love is love." which, it doesn't take long to undo that mantra, right? Because if love is love, then why can't we marry our dogs? Why can't we marry our sister?
Some people try. Some people try.
I know. So
that's a whole other podcast.
And we've said this before. Love actually has almost nothing to do with marriage.
Pretty much.
You hope you have love within a marriage, but marriage is not about love.
No. You don't get married because you love someone. You get married because you want to enter into that condition so that offspring is possible.
And so what happened was the church registered marriages, and they did that for good reason, okay? Because within the confines of the religion, we believe marriage is between one man and one woman, so we didn't want bigamy or polygamy. Right. And so part of that was to register those marriages. That then gets taken over by the state. Now, that's an interesting thing, because I actually do know Christian married couples in authentic marriage relationships who have been married in the church and it not be registered with the government. Because what makes them married? Is it the government, or is it the vows they've made in the presence of God? So, so that exists. Now, I think as heterosexual people, we tolerate our relationships being registered with the government only on the basis that we produce offspring naturally, and therefore there's some stake. The government has some stake, only some, in that relationship. So my gay friends would say, why on earth would I tolerate that kind of interference in my relationship from the government when there's absolutely no legitimate reason for that interference?
I mean, not outside of the tax benefits and maybe the benefits for, like, I know in the United States, I don't know how this works in Europe or Australia, but I know that in the United States, next to kin is very important when a person's dying or having medical procedures done. And so if you're not married to the significant other, the hospitals won't even talk to you about what's going on.
And that did become a problem here. That was one of the arguments, of course. And tax law is a similar thing.
Tax law,
you can fix tax law, and you can fix probate law, and you can fix next of kin laws without denaturing what the government should have nothing to do with marriage. Simple as that.
I agree completely. It's a religious term. It's a religious right. It's a sacrament, for God's sake. That would be like the government regulating the Eucharist and saying that you need to use this kind of wheat from this kind of farm, and only grapes that are grown from Napa Valley in the United States can be used for the. I mean, that's kind of what you'd be entertaining there, and how ludicrous that sounds to us is for the genuine Christian who understands the theology. That's how Father Chris and I are looking at the entirety of a legal marriage, because it's like, it doesn't even make sense. It's a contradiction in terms to have the government regulating something that's entirely a spiritual matter.
Well, I mean, to extend it further, and we really are getting into 1984 stuff now.
Yeah,
it really is what the origin of government registering marriages is the equivalent of every single sexual relationship you have should be registered with the government.
Right. Yeah.
That's really what it's about.
It is. Because it's another way of record keeping.
I think it's so funny.
Another census.
And that's why the gay marriage debate, I was like, what are you even arguing about?
I know. Why do you want this so bad? Well, I mean, I know why they want it, because I understand that they want to be able to be involved in things like medical decisions, and they want to be involved in.
Hey, and that's legitimate.
Absolutely, no question about it. But I mean, I'm kind of like, I mean, I know, I have a lot of gay friends as well.
Philosophically, it makes no sense.
And it's kind of like when they talk about it, it's like, well, I mean, what are you looking for exactly? You're looking for a blessing? Because this church will give you a blessing. I mean, I will never turn anyone down for a blessing. I can't provide a sacrament, but I can bless you. I can definitely do that, and I can bless you together, which I have no problem with doing. It's not in any way I see as a violation, because I don't look at these things as much moral issues as I see them as metaphysical issues. And I do understand the metaphysical issues, and I understand that the moral issues exist because of those metaphysical issues. And those are the things that are not being talked about, which hopefully this show has enlightened a lot of you, so you know where I'm coming from when I say things, because it's not I don't come from a place of judgment. I don't judge anybody. I'm the first one to say, you know what? Live your life. Whatever makes you happy, as long as you're not hurting anyone else, do what works for you. And all the power to you. But
be
if
your
you
most authentic self,
be your most
is
authentic,
what you
that's
say.
what I say. Be your most authentic self. However, that being said, if you run into spiritual problems, which sometimes your authenticity might lead you to, okay, being completely authentic can sometimes lead you astray. I'm the first one to say that too.
Well, because it confronts the other thing we talked about, which is that we're supposed to take on the mind of Christ.
That's it. And some people are not there yet, and I get that. I'm the first one to say, not everyone's there.
If our authentic self is not Christ-like, it's not something we should strive to be.
Correct. I mean, yes.
It wouldn't be truly authentic either, of course.
But that I would say that in order to arrive, though, at that realization, you have to be authentic first to get there. So you might have to actually fall down a few times in order to get yourself back up. It's kind of like I kind of find faith.
Life, definitely,
it is, and I kind of find faith to be like learning to walk. You're going to stumble. You're going to scrape your knee before you get it right. Every toddler does. Okay, when they're that's where the word toddler comes from. For God's sake, it's because they toddle around. I mean, it's they're not steady on their feet. They fall a lot. Babies have the natural instinct to fall on their butts because it's just they're gonna fall. Nature knows this. They're built for it. But the fact is, spiritually, we're like that too. Some of us can be savants spiritually and instantly, be given the gift of faith and know what to do with it and excel. But not everyone is that lucky. And sometimes there is a struggle. And I'm the first one to say, you can't choose who you fall in love with. You can't. And it's going to happen. It's going to happen where sometimes
you can't choose who falls in love with you either.
No, you can't.
And sometimes that's more difficult.
That's true. I mean, that is true. I think, one of the movies that had a great impact on my understanding of the struggle of homosexuals and people in the LGBTQ, community, it was Crying Game. I don't know if you know the premise of that movie.
Forrest Whitaker. Was he in that?
Oh, gosh. I'm not sure I even could tell you who the actor was, but basically the premise of it was so long ago. But the premise of it was there's this guy, and I mean, I'm going to probably butcher it because it's been so long, I don't remember all the details, but there was this guy that is going to this club, and there's a singer there, and he falls in love with the singer. And then eventually it amounts to where they have an intimate moment, and the singer undresses and he sees that there's a penis there.
There's
right.
a surprise. Yeah.
Kind of the shocking moment of the movie, I guess, unless you kind of could tell that there was something going on there. But I mean, he's initially disgusted.
Is in it, by the way. Well done.
Was it? Is it Forrest Whitaker?
Is in it.
Oh, wow. Well done. Well done.
Well, I remember the song.
You say you have memory problems. I mean, I can't remember anything.
Well, when it comes to movies and music and, cartoons.
Your memory's a lot better than you give yourself credit for, though. But, so he initially is disgusted by this because it's like he feels betrayed. Like, think about what you would go through if you fall in love with a girl and she's like the greatest girl, and you realize she's not even a girl. That could be kind of a major how do you reconcile those feelings at that point? Like, think about it from just a complete heterosexual point of view. Let's say you fall head over heels for this person you think is a girl, and she falls head over heels for you. And then once you finally get intimate, you realize that she is not a she at all. Could you continue to still love them? That's the challenge that this movie presents. And I think, if I remember correctly, at the end, he's able to overlook the biological for the love.
Because souls don't have a gender.
Yes. So there's something kind of beautifully spiritual about
on a
that
spiritual
movie.
level, yeah.
Yes. And that I understood. It was the first time I could say, because as a heterosexual man, I can't say, I was always very sympathetic to the plight of people that were different from myself. Being in a majority position, I don't suffer those kinds of injustices that they do. So I'm sympathetic to the fact that there are people that just because they are different from me, they struggle, they suffer. I get it from the standpoint of being, having grown up with autism and having to, live up to everyone else's standards and not being accepted for that. I get it in that direction. So I get that one. But it's still different. But the fact of the matter is, I can also respect that, there is something very spiritual and very mature about being able to look beyond the physical and love the person for who they are. So there is beauty in that.
I respect the struggle. I come to a different conclusion, and that's fine.
Let's hear it.
Struggle, and I don't deny those feelings or that they're genuine or otherwise.
Right. Yeah.
I think though that what is very underplayed, because we're in such a sexualized society, is that not all loving feelings have to be sexually expressed. Now, I understand the nightmare of me saying that when someone says, "All right, for you, you're heterosexual," and blah blah blah, everything's sanctioned that you do.
Yeah, of course.
But
think of the couple from V for Vendetta, the lesbian couple, how they're ripped out of their bed by the government and separated, and their heads shaved, and sort of tortured. Of course, put anybody in that position.
Yeah,
it's horrifying.
One would never want to defend anything like that,
right? But that
I'm not talking about any external force. I'm not talking about any external force put on people at all. But I do think the Christian way is a sacrificial way, and we can't have everything we want, and so. Now that is the deeply countercultural thing to say.
But see, that's but you kind of touched on something that I want to actually backtrack a little bit on, because it's very important here. Because the argument is, you're heterosexual. So I'm not
judging. I'm just saying there is another way.
Right. You're saying that it's easy for you to say. Some people might look at this and say it's easy for you to say you're heterosexual. Everything you do is sanctioned, but not everything you do is sanctioned. No. It really isn't.
Technically, if you're doing anything other than missionary, that's not sanctioned.
Correct.
Depending on who you talk to.
Correct.
We're just being real here.
Intercourse. If you're looking at the strict guidelines for how the church interprets the Judeo-Christian context for the sacrament of matrimony and what it's there to do. It's not a license to have sex with people any way that you want to, or have sex with one person any way you want to. It is strictly for the intent to produce children. And that means, like you said, even if you're doing different positions might be questionable, though I'm not sure the church goes that far on them. I think, though, I would say oral sex is prohibited for that reason, though. So even though you got a husband and a wife that are in a legal marriage in the eyes of the church, it would still not be considered licit sexual interaction to have oral sex, because there's no possibility of producing a child. Now, there might be, the gray area might be to use oral sex as a sort of a precursor or foreplay, but as long as it ends in intercourse, then it's okay. But birth control. This is why the church is against birth control, because if you're limiting or preventing the action for sex from being used for what it's there for, then you're misusing the action of sex, even as a married couple. So, it might seem to the person on the outside saying that, it's easy for us to say, but honestly, the restrictions and the limitations and the reasons for them are quite severe for everybody. It's not just that community.
I think it is more nuanced. What the church teaches is that, listen, people can get married in their 80s. They're very unlikely to have children. Okay?
Yes.
Now, that's not an invalid sexual relationship. The nuance is, it says it must be open to the co-creation with God. So it must be open to that. Now, that's not the same thing as demanding that.
Right.
It must be open to that. And I think for Roman Catholics today, if they really want to, they should really closely read the encyclical from Pope John Paul II.
Yeah.
Which is often quoted as being, against abortion and against. Really read it. Don't just read what a journalist said about it or what a priest said about it. Read the actual
Would they understand it, though, Father? Would most people even understand it?
Well, my reading of that, when I read that, I think if there's a Catholic couple, married couple, who have had 7 children and they don't want any more children, my reading of that encyclical says that's okay. Well,
I'll tell you this. I'm going to tell you something that I once, when I I mean, this is kind of a personal thing, but I don't mind sharing it because I think it's a good educational moment. When I brought Tracy, my wife, into the church, when we came back to the church together, okay, she had never been Christian prior to her prior to her coming into the church. When we had this revelation where I wanted to come back and she felt she needed, it sort of happened internally in both of us. Neither one of us talked about it. We had dinner one night and I sat down and I was very nervous, but I said, I feel like God is calling me. I had an experience, honestly, and I told her about the experience, and then I said, God is calling me back to the church. And I thought like, God, could this end our relationship? Could this be, damaging in some way? And she immediately said, oh my God, I have felt the same way, that I'm supposed to go to the church.
Yeah, you guys told me this story not too long after I joined the church. It was fascinating.
It was. I mean, there's a lot more to it
right.
that I can get into if people are interested, but that's not really the point. I just needed to preface with that. But over the course of, normalizing our relationship with the church, because, I mean, again, we were married outside of the sacrament, so that was the big problem. So Tracy wasn't baptized, had not been confirmed, had never received Eucharist. I had fallen away from the church. I had been away from Eucharist, hadn't gone to confession in years. I mean, I was a mess in terms of this. So all of that had to be fixed and it had to be done in the right order so that we could eventually come to matrimony. But I mean, I remember going to the priest and having to, be counseled through some of this and talk to him about, what needed to be done and, some of the things. And one of the big issues that you see, you don't see it so much in the Roman Catholic Church, although it happens, but what's really big in the Eastern Church is, and I think it's very inappropriate, but it happens, where these older ladies will come up to you and they're kind of like the matriarchs of the church, and they see a young couple there that's been married for a few years and they don't have a child, which at this point we did not have a kid yet. And they're like, why don't you have children? When are you going to have kids? And it's like, well, it's like pretty much going, why don't you just go up to them and be like, how often are you having sex? Why isn't that working? I mean, it's kind of what you feel like when someone says that to you. So it's a very inappropriate, very kind of aggressive question. I did not like it. I did not appreciate it.
That's just somebody being an asshole.
It is an asshole question. Yeah, it is.
Like, I mean, it is. I remember when I was an Anglican and, I'd vest for the Eucharist and wear Catholic vestments. And, these miserable, dour old proddies would say to me, what are you wearing all that for? And I'd be thinking, do you really want to talk about what we're wearing? That handbag with that coat? So, but I didn't say that, of course. But I just think the fact that people ask you these things is so ridiculous. The last thing I would ask a young couple in church is why don't you have children? Because I might make an assumption that they might not be able to have children, and that's a pretty painful conversation to have with somebody who's a complete stranger, And so yes. I always find I try to minimize conversation. I still try to minimize conversation in church. If they're
it always leads to trouble when they do.
Loud music on. You're there to talk to God.
Yes.
And then if somebody wants to speak to you, they'll invite you to go and have a drink afterwards.
But see, in these small, Byzantine Rite churches, it's so
there's no escape.
There's no escape from this, and because you're such a small community, everyone wants to know everybody else. So when you're new coming in, they're all over you. And here we are, this young couple. No kids. And so the big question is, because what they're trying to get at is they're trying to ascertain, are you using birth control? Are you living the life that the church requires of you? These are questions that they're trying to get from you. It's
they're trying to judge you.
Yes, they are.
Have a conversation.
Yeah, judge you without saying they're judging you.
And it felt like it, and it was very clear, too.
Why don't you have kids yet?
Exactly. So anyway, I then eventually talked to the pastor that baptized my wife and confirmed her and married us. I talked to him about children, because at this point we were not in a position to. I had dedicated my life to this point. I was trying to become a priest. I mean, that's the whole reason I was coming into the Eastern Church and not going back to Rome, was because that's part of the story I didn't tell, is that revelation I had that brought me back to the church was also a revelation that led to me to be like, my God, this vocation never left. This vocation I've had all my life is still there, and now I need to do something about it. And now I've overly complicated it because I got married all these years ago, and now I got to figure out a way. And, visiting churches, for those of you who might not be aware, do in some limited circumstances permit a married priesthood. So it seemed like the right course of action to explore at the time. So that was one of the reasons why I went back to the church through the Eastern rites, because that is something that might have been possible. But anyway, we were not, because I had dedicated myself at this point to ministry, and we did not have the financial benefits of what we now enjoy. It would have been quite a struggle to have children at that point in our life. We were not in a financial position where that would have been the right thing to do. And so I went to the pastor, and I asked him, I said, I feel like I'm being judged by the community for not having a kid, and I'm going to be completely honest. We are utilizing birth control because I do feel that the intimacy is important to keep the relationship going. But at the same time, I think a married couple needs intimacy, needs sexual intimacy too. I do. I really think that's a big part of a successful marriage. If you're not, engaging with that part of the relationship, other parts of the relationship do eventually suffer. It's an important part to keep that intimacy alive. And
that's part of the act of creation. It's not just procreation in terms of having babies.
Yes,
it's the creative act of a husband and wife living in that form of unity.
And I saw it as
unique and special.
And I saw it as building our life into where we could one day then have a child, which we did. But I asked him, I said, I know that the church teaches against birth control. I'm going to be honest, we're using it. And I don't know how to, proceed with what we're currently doing because of this. And his answer was brilliant. He said, remember, he says, you only are judged on your sins based upon he put it this way. He says your sins are only established in relation to your conscience, and yes. You cannot violate your conscience. If it violates your conscience to have kids when you're not ready, when you're not in a position to be able to care for them correctly, it would be a far greater sin to just go right into having 1, 2, 3 kids than it would be to prepare your life and use this time to build it into a foundation that could have children in the future. So he said, are you open to having kids when you're able to? I said, yes. Then he says, I think you're fine then. Now,
that was a very wise answer.
It was a wise answer. I don't know if the cookie cutter instruction from the church would agree with it, but that's how he handled it with me.
That came from wisdom. I like that.
I think
that's also why we have priests, though.
Yes,
and a lot it's people who rely on this sort of the center needs to tell me all things of how to live my life. Not only does the church not do that because it's impossible, Christ identified that, which is why the power to bind and loose was given to individual men.
Yes.
And they would then be dispersed throughout the ancient world. And it's far better to be more rabbinic in that style. Like, a Jew, they'd say, ask your rabbi,
Right.
And actually Eastern Orthodox Christians would say, ask your priest.
Yes.
So I'm on forums for Orthodox and for Roman Catholics. And it's so interesting, the difference. Because Roman Catholics will point to encyclicals and this, precedent, whereas the Orthodox will always say, well, I think this, but ask your priest. It always ends with ask your priest, because the priest is about localizing that in exactly the way that he was a good priest, by the way. Exactly in that way of saying, well, what is the essence of the dilemma that you're in? And when it comes to that, I'm not against birth control, and I think that I think things get confused. I'm against birth control that are abortifacient. abortive.
Yeah.
That, in fact, don't prevent pregnancy.
Right.
Like
They
the
just
day after,
immediately destroy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I am against that. And I think the church should be against that.
Yeah.
But to confuse that with, and also we've talked about it already. There's a vast difference between contraception for the sake of promiscuity and contraceptive within a marriage relationship. They're not the same thing.
They are not.
You know, and if a woman's had 11 miscarriages because, you know, there's obviously just something biologically that, awry that's not going to be fixed.
Right.
Why would the church definitely would not say continuing having miscarriages until you reach menopause?
Right. Think what that does
That's
to
a
a
ludicrous
woman's
way of
psyche.
thinking.
Oh, it's
Right.
awful.
Yeah.
It's awful, and it's irresponsible. And I mean, I'm grateful that I did get good counsel, but he was a fantastic priest and not the typical kind of guy. Calling in from Canada, Marina's on the air. Hello,
Okay.
Marina.
Hey, Marina.
Hey, Marina.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
How's everybody doing?
We are doing fantastic. How are you tonight?
I'm good.
Pretty good, thanks. We've been enjoying some good weather for once.
Great. That's fantastic. Yeah, here too. It's been very nice.
Yes. So I wanted to call in, and it's funny that the topic of marriage has been coming up a lot tonight. I actually wanted to wait for the next open lines to ask this question.
Okay.
It makes sense to me that, for example, that any denomination advises people to not marry outside of the Christian faith.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense to me because for many reasons. But for somebody like millennials, like in my age group, where in a country like Canada, where it's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Yes.
And it's actually something
And in
that's
Australia.
it's actually something that causes me actually really honestly a great deal of pain,
Yeah.
because I go, now what do I do? You know? So I wanted to ask about what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, there's something in the church called disparity of cult. And that is where it is allowable for a Christian, or in this case, the Catholic Church, a Catholic, to marry someone of a different denomination or even a different religion, provided that typically the church, I hesitate to say require, but strongly encourages that the children at least are raised in the Christian faith. So even though
It used to be mandated.
mandated, I think now it's just a strong advisory.
Yeah.
But it is permitted, it is permissible. But the reason that it's not desirable is because it does create the seeds of a potential conflict of interest down the road. It's, you came from a disparity of cult. I mean, because you had a Catholic father.
My father
right?
was Catholic and my mother was Protestant.
But you were raised Protestant.
I was raised Protestant,
Yeah.
but was able to go to church with my grandma, to the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Whenever I stayed with her. So I was exposed to both, but I was raised Protestant.
Well, and so at least you had that. At
I
least,
did. Yeah. From what I understand, in the early relationship, there was a lot of tension between the families, and it got worked out, I think, before I was born. But I was able to be exposed to both.
And that helped. I mean,
right.
and here you are.
And here I am, Catholic.
But, but I think what you're asking, though, Marina, is actually something that's even more deeper than just simply the way the church handles marriage when you're dealing with more than one denomination or religion. And that is, of course, how do you deal with the personal disparity, where if you're a person as a Christian that's truly doing the Christian thing, which is, it's a way of life, as I've talked about so often. It's not something you just pick up and do. It's not something you just do for an hour on Sunday. It's not something that you just talk about when you're at church. And it's not as simple as like, well, I'll go to my church, you go to your temple or whatever. Or even worse, marrying someone who's not religious at all and just kind of entertains you. That's going to wear at that relationship over time. It most certainly will. I mean, very few people can be so objective to leave that part out. And then even if you are, let's just say you get lucky and there's this person out there that is able to be that objective, you're still cutting off a big part of yourself from that person that you will never be able to share. And that's going away on you, if not on them. And that's something that will also create what could be a problem down the road in that relationship. So yes, it is desirable that you marry someone that is of the same religious or spiritual dimension as you, someone that understands it the same way, and preferably, you know, is of the same tradition, because it helps. I mean, I even see problems sometimes between Eastern Catholics and Roman Catholics, you know, and they're both Catholic. They can go to, but, you know, what they do is I knew a couple like this. One was a Ruthenian, the other one was Roman Catholic. And so they would go to the Roman Catholic Church one week and then the Ruthenian Church the other week, and they just bounce back and forth. That's how they made it work. But even that's a lot closer than what you might be talking about. And yeah, I understand the needle in a haystack thing, because if you really try to find somebody that meets this criteria, you might never find them, because you know,
and it's happening amongst people in my age group. It is happening.
Yes,
it's like those people are 35 still looking, and it's not happening.
And see, unless you find someone in like, you go to a Catholic school or something, you kind of grow up together, or you went to a church and grew up in the same church community together.
Yeah, I've seen that happen.
It can be hard, really, really, really hard. I knew a guy, a friend. I'm sorry, Father Chris. I'll let you talk. I knew a guy, a friend of mine, who was single for a long time and was sweared. I mean, he was like my age, you know, a little bit younger than me, maybe like 1 or 2 years. And sweared that he'd never find anybody, because he had done much what you were saying, where he insisted he'd only marry Catholic, and all of the people at his church were either old or not or already married, and there was just nobody available. But eventually somebody moved into the church and they struck up a conversation, and then immediately hit it off, and they got married. And I think they're still happily married to this day. And this was years ago. So it can happen. I think the important thing is, and the best advice I could give to someone like you is to simply let God handle it. The worst thing anybody can do, whether you're looking for someone who's of the same faith as you or not, the worst thing you can do is try to make a relationship happen. It has to happen organically. Otherwise, it will never have the chance of success. At that point, it will just be statistical. It will just be the roll of the dice. They might work, they might not work. But the only ones that are guaranteed to have lasting spiritual value are those that happen organically. And what I mean by that is that God's really the one that kind of brings you together. So if it's his will, it will occur. If it's not his will, it won't occur. You know, and we kind of just have to be grateful for that and be patient with that process, because it can sometimes be a lonely, difficult one. And I hate to say it, and I kind of almost disagree with it a little bit, but I can't really, because the evidence is too clear. But there is 3 states of vocation. There's clerical, there's marital, and even the single life is a vocation, whether we like it or not. It is. Some people.
It's actually the one preferred by St. Paul.
It was. He said, like, don't even waste your time.
Yeah. You know, so I think Marina, you know, I kind of, I do empathize with the situation.
Yeah, it's tough.
And I think that, and it's hard to swallow. And look, we live in a culture that tells us, we should be able to get anything we want, and yet we know we can't. But I think I certainly cross-cult marriages can work, between Orthodox and non-Orthodox, or whatever, as long as the fundamental cultural background aligns. Now, yes, it's hard to find young Christian men in Canada, no doubt. But you would have a lot in common with a Canadian man, whether he was a Christian or not, because you have a similar cultural background. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's all that different, to remove the spiritual aspect for a while, which I know is obviously, I believe, is important, but it's not as important as a similar philosophical approach. I think, for example, it's much easier for a Southern Baptist and a Catholic to remain in a marriage if they have the same economic outlook. Like, I think it's much more difficult for two Orthodox Christians to be in a marriage if one of them believes a man can be a woman and a woman can be a man, and the other one thinks that things are very stratified and are very traditional. So there's the sort of temperamental alignment and also a basic philosophical alignment that is really important. And I think if those things are aligned, you might even be with somebody who's not a Christian. But if those things are aligned and there's a genuine love between the two of you, then it could work. And that's where prayer comes in. Then that's not to suggest that it wouldn't be far preferable if you were spiritually aligned as well. But again, St. Paul has something to say about that. Admittedly, it's for people who are already married, but he says, well, the husband would be saved through the faith of the wife. And which is to say that if there is that meeting of minds, and knowing something about you, Marina, because I do, if you find somebody who has similar values and principles to you, it wouldn't surprise me if they didn't come to faith.
Yeah.
But if you can't enter into a marriage going, well, as long as he converts to Christianity, this will work. You obviously that's
no, but you could be. I mean, that's not to say that you couldn't find somebody that might be open to that, because they might truly not have any position on anything and are really needing someone who could guide them more deeply into a faith. And if they see in you and love you, they might fall in love with your faith through you, which is something that does happen and can be very successful. And then what a beautiful thing that it doesn't only just end up in a long-term, relationship or a marriage, but also a conversion as well. So
you just couldn't marry somebody that's like Richard Dawkins,
I'd stay away from him. Yeah,
he's a bit old.
He might give you $1 million if you can prove that the paranormal exists, though. That could be worth something. It's true. I mean, this guy, it's like, I really think that he has got this fail-safe built in, which is why he said, I'll give $1 million to anyone that will prove to him that the paranormal exists, because it's like, there's nothing anyone could ever do to convince this guy.
No.
I mean, so it's like, it's a foolish thing for him to have even said, because it's like he goes into every experiment already convinced that it's not real. Not to mention that a lot of the things that the paranormal deals with kind of works against tangible evidence, in the sense that it doesn't want to be known. See, that's the part that science doesn't want to accept about, is that the reason it's called occult is because it is truly trying to be secret. It doesn't want to be revealed. These mysteries are mysteries because they are so elusive. And science is the opposite of the elusive. It's about tangibility. It's about observation and direct observation and repeating those observations to verify that things are true. And the paranormal can never work at that level, because it's just not within its nature to be that empirical. It actually will change its nature to become more elusive. So it will be tangible for a time until it finds that you're trying to prove something about it, and then it will change just to screw with you. So he's he's fooling himself. It shows how little he actually understands about spirituality and the paranormal. And it makes him kind of, I don't know, kind of a typical scientific asshole, in my opinion. I can't stand the guy. I don't like him.
But Marina has also identified a real problem in the Western Church, which is that there are not enough men in it.
True.
No.
And so if you look at who is it no, this shouldn't surprise us.
Well,
who was it that didn't abandon Christ on the cross? It was the women.
The women.
Women are far more likely to be Christians.
Look at what I have in my look at this church. Look at our, well, you don't see it because I have as the channel owner, I see the demographics. Mm-hmm. But this show,
mine is unusual. We're mainly men, but that might be something to do with how I kind of shamelessly aim for that.
Well,
only because they're underrepresented, and that's a real crisis for the church.
Yeah.
Well, this show's demographic
I'm doing my
is
bit, Marina.
About 80% women, 20% men that watch this show, and I would imagine if you look at the demographic on the mass, it's probably 90% women and 10% men.
I am woman, hear me roar.
Well, next week we are coming back with another episode. I think it's the Bigfoot researcher, isn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah, so this is going to be one
And Harley, I see your question in there. If you can take it to the network, we can probably have a pretty good exchange over there. They had some good questions.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, the
always
call
come
came
at the
in.
end of the show.
Yeah, there's a pretty good exchange.
Well, next time. And if you send it to me through email, office@nicolaine.org, I'll answer it on the next questions and comments from the ether.
There you go, Harley.
But we'll be back Tuesday with Bigfoot at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll see you then. Take care. God bless. And I'll see you out there in the ether.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.